Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to start finding your seats? Mr. Walsh is here and we'd like to get started relatively soon because we have a full program and we don't want to rush it. So please take your seat.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and I am so very pleased to welcome you here today for the awarding of the Weintal Prize for Diplomatic Reporting and a discussion with the award recipient, the Chief Africa Correspondent for the New York Times, Declan Walsh. We're so pleased to be able to honor him here today, and we are so pleased to be able to hear from him about his career in reporting, and in particular now his time working across Africa as the New York Times Chief Africa Correspondent. I want to begin, first of all, by some thanks. I want to welcome, of course, everyone here, the faculty, the guests, our students who are joining us today. I want to note there is, and we're very pleased to have some guests from the press corps, as well as Africa-focused hands from the State Department, and we're very pleased to have you, as well as think tankers and other guests. I want to thank, in particular, our Center for African Studies, Professor Laura Smith, who leads that program and support for our students engaged in African studies, and our journalism program, Rebecca Cinderbrand, for their support and engagement in this program. I'd like to thank, of course, the endowment for this award, the Edward Teddy Weintal Endowment, and the leaders of that endowment, one of whom is going to be here interviewing Declan Walsh, that's Andrea Mitchell, as well as Marvin Cal. The endowment has given us 50 years of support and engagement on this award, as well as a scholarship for SFS students. So we are very, very pleased to be able to host this award ceremony here today. Now, of course, we are extremely excited to be able to recognize the critical importance of a free and credible press to our democracy, to our overall global policy making, and recognize how fundamental that is to this country, enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution, but more even importantly, to our understanding of the global order. That's why 50 years ago, it was decided at the School of Foreign Service that it is critical to recognize the role of an independent and free press as a critical part of our understanding of international affairs and a critical part of our education for students in international affairs. So this is an annual opportunity for us to recognize the critical importance. But I am especially pleased today for this awardee at this particular moment, As I said, Declan Walsh not only brings a career of foreign and diplomatic reporting across multiple countries in South Asia and now across Africa, but at this moment, as Chief Africa Correspondent for the New York Times, he is bringing to us reporting on a critical set of countries, a critical group of cultures, a critical region of the world that needs to be highlighted in our understanding of where the global order is going. At this very moment, as we are so concerned, and in fact even consumed by the reawakening of great power competition between the United States and China, as we reassess and talk about a new Cold War that we're entering into at the great power level, that we talk about great power competition, Russia, China, the United States. In that din of discussion about great power competition, we hear so little about what's happening across Africa. And yet what's happening across Africa is going to be so critical to where the global order goes. If we look at demographic trends alone, by 2050, 2 out of every 5 children in the world will be born in Africa. Just this week, the New York Times reported that Nigeria's birth rate alone exceeds the entirety of the European Union. So we are seeing a demographic trend here of tremendous importance that is going to shape the global order, the future of population trends as Africa grows at this incredible pace, as Europe and Asia begin to reduce their demographic trends, suggests that Africa will be at the center of the conversation. At the same time, we know that more than half of African countries are currently classified in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, that we know that at the very time in which their demographies suggest an increasingly young population that needs to be educated, that needs to get health care, we know that the shrinking fiscal space as a result of their debt distress is leading to lower investments in education and lower investments in health. And we know that of all of the 32 measurable sustainable development goal targets that the UN has set, only 6% of them are on track for Africa. So what we see is this critical demographic trend coupled with an economic trend that suggests that the investments needed to make the most of this demographic trend are not going to come to fruition in the coming years. So we need to be paying attention to Africa. We are already seeing some of the results of this gap between development, between the support services needed to ensure that Africans can live a healthy, productive, and engaging life that will reduce the trends towards political pressure, violence, and even conflict. So it is at this moment that we are so pleased to be able to bring to this stage someone who has been working to bring the story of Africa, the potential momentum, the positive trends, the negative trends, the conflicts that are facing, but the innovation that we're sort of seeing across the African continent to the public through the New York Times. So it's with that that I am so happy to be here today for this honor to Declan Walsh, to hear from him about what he sees as the trends in Africa, and to be part of this conversation that I hope you will participate in through your questions and comments, so that we all have a better understanding of how Africa fits into the extraordinary changes that we're seeing in the global order. So with that, let us begin the prize festivities, if you will, and if I can bring out Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who heads the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, to welcome you and to give you some background on the event and on our honoree. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Hellman, and thank you for providing that wonderful context within which we are going to be talking about Africa and its challenges and its potential in welcoming Declan for this award. I am Barbara Bodine, I am the director. Um, and I also want to thank Laura Smith and Rebecca Sunderbrand for all of their support and assistance in making this event happen. Your guidance and your counsel and your ideas were instrumental. And Marvin Kalb, who is, I know, watching this on stream, and Andrea Mitchell, the Weintal trustees, the Weintal Endowment, as the dean noted, for 50 years has been hosting this award and also supporting our students. Briefly on this, the program, so you know what to expect. I will introduce Mr. Walsh, and then we will have a conversation with Declan and Andrea Mitchell, after which we will open this up to questions from the audience, and I truly encourage you to ask questions. Oops, sorry, we switched the program, so I have to change some of my remarks. Anyway, in regards to the question and answer, I would just remind you all of the Georgetown standards on promoting speech and expression, and ask you to please be respectful of the views of others in your questions. Begun in 1975, the Weintal Prize is the oldest of the Institute's public outreach programs. The late Edward Teddy Weintal was a Polish diplomat who then became a diplomatic correspondent. He bequeathed funds to Georgetown to support this annual prize, as well as a 2-year scholarship for SFS students with a background in journalism, and 3 of those recipients are with us today. The prize, established by a diplomat turned journalist, recognized the critical role that a strong, thoughtful, analytic diplomatic reporting plays in our understanding of international events and its impact on foreign policy. I also want to touch on another link between journalism and diplomacy, and that is Benjamin Franklin. Before his role in the Continental Congress, and where he is best known for his cautionary response to the adoption of the Constitution, a republic, if you can keep it, Ben Franklin was also a journalist, and he was also our first diplomat. He was a staunch advocate for freedom of speech and a free press, and he was also an effective and early practitioner of multilateral diplomacy and artful negotiations. So we have Weintal, diplomat turned journalist, and Franklin, journalist turned diplomat. Our 2 professions are often wary partners, sometimes adversaries, but we have very deep and common roots. Good journalism informs the public and policymakers, not just of breaking news, but of emerging or forgotten crises. They shine a very bright light on issues, events, people that might otherwise be overlooked or ignored. They make us look not just at what is happening, but why we should care and why it is important. And they expose the fault lines and the missteps and the consequences on the ground and for us. There is one school of foreign policy that events not directly and immediately affecting us can and perhaps should be ignored. They're not our problem. Let the conflict burn itself out. What the diplomatic journalists, most especially those in the field, remind us is that ignoring a crisis does not solve a crisis. It feeds a crisis. Suffice it to say that Teddy Weintal, who lived through the consequences of crises ignored, sought through this award to recognize original and courageous reporting in the hopes that we would avoid the same fate again. Marvin Kalb, who is one of the trustees and was a personal friend of Teddy and is a current member of my board, said of Declan, "Teddy would be pleased. When we set up this prize, we had reporters like Declan in mind. He maintains a worthy tradition." As we all know, reporting from and about Africa is rare. Africa is poorly understood and underappreciated. especially in Washington policy circles and perhaps beyond. Understanding is mired in stereotypes, few of them flattering, and I will not use the description of Africa voiced by one senior administration official a few years ago. That lack of understanding, of appreciation, and thus good policy extends to both the very real challenges and the very real potential of this continent. And by potential, I mean more than the scramble for critical minerals, but it is the potential of the people, and especially the young people, as the Dean explained, who are desperate for generational, economic, and political change. They are really the true resource of the future. The challenges are real, and they must be addressed to unleash this potential, and Africa cannot be ignored. Declan and his team in Nairobi do not allow Africa to be ignored. His in-depth reporting and investigative journalism shines a very bright light and creates that awareness and changes the conversation. Born and raised in Ireland, he studied at the University College of Dublin and Dublin City University. He joined the New York Times after 7 years with The Guardian, where he covered Pakistan and Afghanistan. Following that, he worked out of Cairo, covering the Middle East. A seasoned conflict zone reporter, he wrote a column during the US 2016 presidential campaign called Abroad in America. And since 2020, he has been based in Kenya, where he had previously worked as a freelance reporter. His work as chief Africa correspondent and his reporting on the Sudanese civil war have earned him and the Times staff the 2025 Pulitzer Prize for International Journalism, as well as the George Polk Award and the James Foley Medill Award Medal for Courage in Journalism, the Robert F. Kennedy Sr. 2019 Journalism Award for reporting from Yemen, and a 2024 award with the rest of the New York Times team for coverage of Russia and Ukraine. He has covered everywhere, everything. As Marvin said, Declan is just the sort of diplomatic correspondent that Teddy Weintal would appreciate and would applaud. So please join me in that applause for Declan Walsh.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bodine, and also to Dean Hellman for those extremely kind introductory remarks. I've spent much of my career speaking with, reporting on, and learning from American diplomats, so it's a special privilege to receive this recognition from the School of Foreign Service here in Georgetown. Thank you again. I'm especially delighted to be here with students of international relations and also with friends and colleagues I've known from postings in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. We've been drawn together not only by professional interest, but also by a deep curiosity about the countries that we've worked in, and often a mutual concern for the people who live there. Over the years, American diplomats have offered me help and advice. They've shared their understanding of difficult places. Sometimes we disagreed on the coverage. Sometimes we shared a joke. I want to start off by telling you about some years ago, while working for the New York Times in Pakistan, I invited a senior American diplomat in Islamabad over for a drink. It was the height of Washington's recent involvement in Pakistan, when the CIA was carrying out drone strikes in the tribal belt, and it was shortly before the raid in Abbottabad and the killing of Osama bin Laden. As we were sipping our whiskey on the lawn, I explained to my guest that my new dog, a stray who had wandered in off the street a few days earlier, was now sharing my courtyard. I think I might have referred to the dog as a walk-in. In that case, my guest quipped, "Did he bring any special information?" It struck me then, as it still does now, how all of our jobs are essentially about the search for information, for privileged insight. And today I want to talk about how the terrain that we share in Africa and the way, I want to talk about the terrain that we share in Africa and the ways in which the map is shifting beneath our feet on an axis with implications that stretch from countries like Sudan and Somalia all the way perhaps even to this room. The role of middle powers in Africa has fascinated me since I returned to Nairobi 5 years ago as the chief Africa correspondent for The Times. Arriving in the country, I figured at first that the main focus of my reporting might be the rivalry between the US and China. But in fact, it quickly became clear that the China storyline was going to underdeliver. And in many places that I was most interested in, it seemed that a lot of the running was being done by smaller powers that seemed to be rushing in everywhere across the continent, buying ports or mines, propping up autocrats, supplying drones, shaping wars. By middle powers, I mean states that do not yet, at least, claim superpower status like the US or China, but countries with resources, ambitions, and military technology like drones that give them a reach that extends far beyond their size. In the deserts of northern Sudan, I discovered an enormous gold mine that was being run by operatives from Russia's Wagner Group. In Somalia, I found that Turkey's largest embassy in the world was in the capital Mogadishu and in the city center, far away from the secured green zone where most Western countries were hunkered down. And across the continent, it emerged that the United Arab Emirates had overtaken China as the largest new investor in Africa. Researchers at the University of Denver counted 400 new embassies that had opened in Africa since 2012. Turkey, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and India topped the list. All of this came as the United States, France, and other Western countries with a traditional base in Africa or traditional relations in Africa were starting to pull back or be pushed out. In the Sahel, American and French troops were being forced to withdraw from Niger, Mali, and Chad, in some cases making way for Russian mercenaries who took their place. And more recently, of course, Western aid programs have been defunded or dismantled, most notably USAID. President Trump's main focus on African refugees now, in a marked contrast with his predecessors, has landed on the plight, or so-called plight, of white nationalist Afrikaners in South Africa. Now, of course, many of these middle powers already had long-standing relationships in Africa. But what had changed was that they were expanding aggressively into new areas and building new relationships. Not just mining strategic minerals or building ports, but also picking favorites, backing strong men, as I said, interfering in wars. And that's a topic that has rarely been as urgent as it is right now. 10 days after the fall of the city of El Fasher in the western Sudanese region of Darfur. There, after 18 months of siege, the paramilitary forces of the Rapid Support Forces have seized control of the city, pushing out Sudan's military, but then going on a rampage that has led to reports of massacre and rape on a scale that is shocking even by the standards of Sudan's brutal civil war. And behind the RSF stands their main foreign supporter, the United Arab Emirates, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. About a month ago, as the siege was reaching its bloody climax, I reached a doctor at the city's last functioning hospital. His name was Dr. Omar Selek, and I connected with him over one of the few remaining Starlink connections still operating in El Fasher. We talked for about an hour, during which time he portrayed a picture of the grim conditions for the 250,000 people who were still trapped in El Fasher. He told me that shellfire was falling randomly, sometimes hitting his own roof. Armed drones hovered in the skies, killing people in the street. The hospital he worked in, the Saudi maternity hospital, had been repeatedly hit, hitting staff, or killing staff, sometimes patients. And food, above all food, was in desperately short supply. Because you see, for months, the RSF had been building a high earthen berm around El Fasher, and now it was 35 miles long, encircling the city and choking off the last supplies of food and essential medicines. Dr. Omar told me that at the Saudi hospital where he worked, the dozens of malnourished children who were turning up every day were being given animal feed, usually given to camels or donkeys, because that was all that was left to eat. At that point in the conversation, Dr. Selleck asked that we switch on our cameras and turn it into a video call. And he used his phone to show me the plate of food that he was eating for his lunch, a sludgy brown substance, which it turned out was also animal feed. But then his somber face broke into this enormous grin because he said that he was happy just to see a stranger's face so that he could feel connected with the outside world, to have a sense that people were watching, quite literally to feel seen. A few days after that, Dr. Selleck went to say his Friday prayers at a mosque a few hundred meters from his house. Around that time, witnesses saw a drone hovering overhead, which fired a missile at the mosque, killing maybe 75 people inside, and one of them was Dr. Selleck. Obviously, this attack was a sign of how drones are reshaping African battlefields at a stunning rate, often following the example of the conflict in Ukraine. They recently discovered bundles of this very fine fiber optic cable in Sudan, the kind that enables drone operators to tether drones and circumvent the technology that jams radio signals. But more profoundly, I think the drone strike was really a jarring reminder of how Sudan's war is being shaped by the machinations of foreign powers. Our reporting at the New York Times has showed that since the earliest days of the conflict in 2023, Abu Dhabi has supplied the RSF with powerful drones, just like the one that killed Dr. Selleck. The UAE has smuggled weapons through a remote airbase in eastern Chad, under the flag of the oldest and most respected symbol in international aid, the Red Cross and Red Crescent. It has set up a field hospital that has treated wounded fighters coming over the border, evacuating some of them by air to military hospitals in the UAE. And from the same base, it has flown those Chinese drones in support of the RSF siege in Al Fasher, and separately supplied drones that have more recently carried out strikes hundreds of miles away on the other side of Sudan, in Khartoum and the de facto capital, Port Sudan. It's even supplied fighters. When I spoke to Dr. Selleck, he told me that he had encountered mercenaries from Colombia who were fighting alongside the RSF inside Al Fasher, and that they had been recruited by companies from the UAE. Now, it's important to note that the UAE, which staunchly denies any support to the RSF, is by no means the only foreign actor taking sides in this war. Sudan's military has also been regularly accused of war crimes and has bought or obtained drones from Turkey and Iran and received other weapons or military support from Russia, Qatar, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Its airstrikes on crowded markets have sometimes killed hundreds of civilians at once, and pro-democracy activists in army-held areas have been detained and tortured. But the UAE is by far the most consequential foreign actor in Sudan. Amid the chaos of the war, I followed the tracks of its key patron-client relationship in Sudan, which centered on the RSF leader, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, widely known as Hemeti, a one-time commander of the feared Janjaweed militias now a putative national leader. Hemeti's ties to the UAE started a decade ago during the war in Yemen, when he sent Sudanese troops to fight on the Emirati payroll in southern Yemen. Now, the Emiratis have been flying him around in a large private jet to meet African leaders and providing extensive logistical support. The arms, the gold smuggling networks, the smuggling routes from neighboring states, all of that was part of what I traced in my reporting. But it was also about very personal relationships. Hemeti, it turned out, had developed close ties with the most senior figures in the UAE, the country's leader, Mohammed bin Zayed, and also his younger brother, Mansour bin Zayed, a figure better known as the West as someone who owned super yachts or racehorses, and as the owner of the English soccer club, Manchester City. Now, the involvement of this bewildering plethora of foreign powers has completely transformed Sudan's war, turning it from what started as a battle between these two rival military factions and their power-hungry leaders into a sprawling conflict that has now engulfed Africa's third largest country and created the world's largest humanitarian crisis, with at least 12 million people displaced, maybe 400,000 people killed by the highest estimates, and a raging famine that reports even just a couple of days ago have confirmed is continuing to spread. What's in it for these foreign powers? The motives differ greatly. But returning to the UAE, there's several ways to look at it. There's a rational argument that the UAE needs access to Sudan's rich agricultural land for its own interests. There's a strategic aspect. So many countries are jostling for a perch on Sudan's Red Sea coast, alongside one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, a key demand for Russia as it supplies weapons to Sudan's military. It's pressing for its naval ships to have access to the Red Sea, or to the ports. And there's politics too. Since the Arab Spring in 2011, the UAE's foreign policy in many parts of the region has been driven by hostility towards the forces of what it sees as political Islam. And the RSF leader, Hemeti, has positioned himself as an anti-Islamist, for whatever that's worth, in a conservative Muslim-majority country. But more broadly, I see Sudan as one part of a much more a broader dynamic of change that goes beyond individual leaders or countries or conflicts. Since the war in Iraq and President Obama's refusal to enforce a red line in Syria, it seems to me that American engagement in these regions has been reduced, of course. And in Africa, where much of the focus of Western engagement, at least partly, had been on the international development system, a system that certainly scored some successes, helping to drive down the numbers of people in absolute poverty, also had some flaws, but the rapid dismantling of USAID this year and huge aid cuts being instigated by other Western countries has had a devastating impact on many parts of the continent. At the same time, Western military engagement is shrinking fast as the French and Americans are being pushed out of the Sahel. And it feels like the entire contract between the West and African countries is being redrawn at a head-spinning pace. So stepping into that breach are some of the countries I've already mentioned, the Gulf states, Turkey, Russia, others. They play off different rules, different advantages. The Turks have built a large military training base in Somalia, but also exported drones, deployed contractors, and launched commercial investments in many parts of Africa in a way that sits somewhere between what I would call the Western and the Chinese models of engagement. Their Bayraktar drone system is coveted by many armed groups because it is so well suited to African battlefields. Russia and its proxies, including the Wagner Group, or now the Africa Corps as it's known, operate differently. They've offered brute force, regime preservation, in exchange for resource access, all in one package. In Mali, Central African Republic, Libya, Sudan, Russian security contractors exchanged that support for mining concessions. The great power line blurs a little here with Russia, but I think that its pattern aligns with the middle power logic in Africa: flexible, transactional, willing to accept risk. And of course, the Emirates just simply bring their incredible wealth to the game, especially in investments, setting up ports from Somalia to Congo, ringing the continent, now investing heavily in strategic minerals. Last year, the Emirates spent $1 billion on a single copper mine in Zambia, and it was one of several acquisitions. Of course, nearly all of the gold that is exported from Africa, illegally or often smuggled, ends up in Dubai. And as we've seen in the Sudan context, the Emirates has emerged as the leading proponent of this expeditionary form of engagement, supporting autocratic leaders like Abiy Ahmed, but also non-state actors like the RSF, part of an effort to build a crescent of allies that now stretches from the Red Sea through the Nile Basin and the Sahara up to the southern shores of the Mediterranean. In Chad, the Emirates has given arms and money to the embattled President Mahamat Deby. In the Libyan city of Benghazi, it continues to prop up the strongman Khalifa Haftar. In Somalia, cargo planes laden with arms and mercenaries cycle through an airfield in Bosaso. Lastly, I'll just mention Qatar, which often positions itself as a mediator, but its economic outreach is extensive. And in Africa, it seems to be competing with the UAE and Saudi Arabia for influence and investment. We can see that Qatar's sovereign wealth fund is Qatar's engagement is much less overtly paramilitary than other actors, but it shouldn't be underestimated as it competes with its neighbors in Africa. Across Africa's conflict zones and trading ports, we can see that the old maps of global influence are being redrawn. Why now? To some extent, they are rushing into a vacuum left by the slow withdrawal, recently speeded up, of Western powers. And certainly, the Trump administration, which initially paid very little heed to Africa, has become increasingly engaged. Since last summer, it's tried to leverage peace for access to minerals in the Congo, hoping to create supply chains for vital resources in a sector that is now largely dominated by China. More recently, it appears to be turning to Sudan. But its interests, its attention span seems to be very short, and its efforts so far have been uncertain. Meanwhile, these middle powers are not only rushing in to fill a vacuum, they are rushing in to Africa to meet their own urgent needs, their anxieties about a future without oil. They want to develop their own economies. They want to secure future sources of food, or simply to develop the sort of strategic muscle that they believe will in future bring them strategic clout. Africa has become their testing ground, their battleground, sometimes their prize. From my time reporting, I'd just like to offer you a few quick thoughts and observations. African agency matters, but it is constrained. The colonial era in the 19th century famously was known as the scramble of Africa. But what we see now is more like a scramble by Africa. At these African summits hosted by governments in Beijing, St. Petersburg, Tokyo, here in Washington, we see African leaders, often themselves struggling with mounting debt, picking and choosing between foreign allies for their own needs. So African governments are not mere pawns. But when a patron offers these quick security fixes, infrastructure or investment without long-term conditions, risks arise. Look at the Central African Republic, where the embattled President Touadéra turned to Russia and the Wagner Group some years ago to save his regime. Yet what's followed is yet more fighting, more abuses, against a backdrop of massive diamond and gold extraction, while stability for most people in that country remains elusive. The growth of the middle powers is also a challenge to the traditional tools of accountability: human rights monitoring, arms embargo, conditional investment strategies. All of these are being circumvented by the middle powers and their private contractors and opaque funding arrangements. The United Nations is growing ever weaker on the continent, and not just from American funding cuts. In recent years, we've seen a sort of unholy alliance between middle powers and their African allies as they try to blunt or dismantle important tools of accountability, such as the United Nations human rights bodies or the vital investigations that are led by UN panels in numerous troubled countries. I think we're seeing conflict and commerce emerge. As our own reporting showed in Sudan, the RSF can at once run an enormous gold mining operation and also a multi-billion-dollar business empire that has entered in Dubai and fight a war at the same time. The growing strength of these middle powers is making American diplomacy in Africa look weaker. The Biden administration, for instance, privately admonished the UAE over its role in Sudan, and President Trump's envoy, Massad Boulos, recently launched a push for peace in Sudan. But judging from the public messaging, it's very clear that much more other economic, military, or technological priorities are taking precedence. Just this past Saturday, soon after the fall of Fasher, the State Department issued a statement that bemoaned the atrocities, condemned the fighters, but avoided any mention of who was actually fueling or funding the fight. On that same day, an Undersecretary of State arrived in Abu Dhabi, where he hailed the government there as a critical strategic partner for the US and a force for peaceful prosperity in the Middle East. More than anything, the human cost of these changes is high and heartbreaking. When I was in Sudan earlier this year, we were in Khartoum when the city fell, changed hands between Sudan's military and the RSF. I found myself walking among mothers who could not feed their children. In Libya, I saw how armed sponsorship of armed groups had helped to tear the country apart with no easy path to putting it back together again. And looking forward now, I think the looming concern is in northern Ethiopia, where fears of a new war between Ethiopia and Eritrea are running hot. Again, here the UAE plays a key role as the main foreign ally and sometimes sponsor of Ethiopia's unpredictable leader, Abiy Ahmed. And if a war does erupt, it is likely to be devastating. If the last conflict in Tigray in 2020 and 2021 is any guide, it was a war that led to probably hundreds of thousands of deaths and a famine, although one was never officially declared. In many of those places, the growing role of these middle powers is not a geopolitical abstraction. It's becoming woven into the fabric of national politics, and in extreme circumstances, for people, can make the difference between life and death. Where is this all taking Africa? I think that, for me, I see the interest by some of these actors, so many actors, in getting involved in this continent, previously neglected, I think, is a recognition of a broader truth about Africa, which, in many other ways, is the continent of the future. In 1950, Africans made up 8% of the world's people. By 2050, they are projected to account for 1/4 of humanity and at least 1/3 of all young people between the ages of 15 and 24. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is aging. In India, the world's most populous country, the median age is 28. In China and the United States, it's 38. In Africa, it's 19. I focused a lot in this talk on battlegrounds in Africa, but it's always important to say that this is only one part of the continent's story. I live in Kenya, and I travel to many other parts of the country where the experience of the people I meet, the societies I move in, is actually quite different. There, Africa is a continent that is fizzing with possibility, some of it driven by this sweeping demographic change. You can hear it in the Afrobeats music that is now so popular across the world. You can see it in movies and TV and in fashion. You can also sense the great challenges that it is bringing, particularly in bringing employment for all those young Africans and the sense of restlessness that is rising, which I see as driving many of what's now known as the Gen Z protests we've seen recently in Morocco, Madagascar, last year in Kenya. My sense of it is that these middle powers I've been speaking about sense this potential, particularly, of course, with their business investments, even if for now their focus appears to be very narrowly trained on minerals or imports or on pliable rebel groups. But it's clear to me that as the continent is evolving and the old Western modes of engagement with Africa collapse or shift, at least some of these middle powers are here to stay. They don't always seem to act in a very strategic or coordinated manner. They often appear to be opportunists, cherry pickers, intervening when and how they can. This isn't traditional great power patronage. It's aggressive, competitive, regional statecraft. One of the major differences with the traditional approach from Western countries. And it's unclear if the ambitions of some of these countries will be matched by staying power. But I've got no doubt that some of them will endure, and the impact of their approach is being felt now all the way down to the streets. As I said a moment ago, earlier this year I was in Khartoum at this dramatic moment when it was changing hands. That after 2 years of battle, the Sudanese military pushed the RSF out of the city. And as I traveled into areas that had recently changed hands, I met Sudanese who told me, who were clearly very aware that their plight was being shaped not just by the battles that were unfolding around them, but by the machinations of these distant new patrons meddling in the country and the interests that they brought. It all suggests to me that if Africa is to be a partner and not a playground for these middle powers, then the rest of the world also needs to understand these dynamics or risk being overtaken by them. Because although this talk is framed around battlefields, this is not a battlefield defined by trenches alone, but also by mines and ports and contracts and alliances. And the prize is not merely territory, but influence and resources. And beneath all of that are real human lives, people like Dr. Omar Selek and others who find themselves trapped in conflict zones between sometimes rapacious local leaders and bigger powers seeking to influence the destiny of their countries and their lives. Thank you again for this prize. And thank you for the invitation to speak here at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. I'm looking forward to speaking with Andrea Mitchell, a journalist I've long admired, and to taking your questions in the discussion that will follow.
I think I said something about shining a bright light on issues that don't get the attention, don't get the appreciation, and don't get the action that they deserve. And I think you have shown an extraordinarily bright light on dynamics in a critical part of the world. And also, I think, shifting the focus from what is sometimes our obsession with great power competition and not understanding the force of so many other powers on issues of security, poverty, development, and the future. The statistic on the percentage of the world's population that is so young and so large in Africa speaks for itself, so thank you. I'd like to invite Andrea Mitchell, who is one of the Weintal trustees, and she is a trailblazer in not just women in journalism, but in journalism for everyone. She has worked and interviewed, I think, 8 presidents, gone through more transitions than anybody in the government. And she is known for asking the tough questions and then getting an answer. The words legend and icon are thrown around rather freely. She's the real deal. So, Andrea, please. There you go. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, it's wonderful to see all of you. Thank you, and Ambassador Bodine, and I want to speak to my mentor, Marvin Cowell, my fellow trustee who worked on this and has brought me into it and was one of my great colleagues after his legendary career at CBS. He came to NBC, and I learned so much from him about covering the State Department. And I just want to say I am so excited to meet you in person because I have admired and been stunned by your reporting for so long. And this week still. Today at the White House was, I think, the first time a question about Sudan was raised at the briefing. And the press secretary said she had just asked Secretary of State / National Security Advisor Rubio about that before coming out, and that the US was deeply engaged in the Quad in these negotiations. And I remember being told that, and I was traveling with our UN ambassador, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, to the Chad border, where she was interviewing refugees and trying to shine a light on it, and then was going to come back in that, this was 2 years ago, in that July, the next July, she was going to be president of the Security Council and thought she would hold hearings to force the UN to finally take action. And we took a decrepit UN plane in and had to leave before nightfall because there were no lights. And she walked through the thick desert sands to get to the border, and with the translator, talked to these women. The lucky ones had a goat or some vehicle, but not a vehicle, but a cart. The others were walking with their children, mostly girl children, because the boys had all been taken or killed. And there was a Doctors Without Border tent. It wasn't even a UN camp yet. Well, you know what Andrea looks like. And then about a month later, I was at the UN General Assembly, and I looked at the New York Times, and I read that there was a military-grade airbase 200 miles to the north. And it was your reporting for which you were recognized by the Pulitzer. And I started asking questions, and it was quickly confirmed, oh yes, said US officials, at cabinet level US officials, we know about that. And so they were negotiating with the UAE and with the Saudis and various floating groups of either the French or the Brits or whoever in the so-called Quad. And we are negotiating a ceasefire in the civil war, which led, of course, to the collapse 10 days ago of al-Fashir and this horrendous tragedy. And we're negotiating with the very people who are arming them with Chinese-made drones. And I was so outraged, and I've been wanting to meet you and thank you ever since, because we've tried to do some reporting. No one can match what you're doing, but just the fact that this lone reporter is going to these places and exposing just the the hideous hypocrisy of our diplomacy or non-diplomacy. So let me ask you about that now that Al-Fashir is, I mean, you can see it from space. You can see the blood-stained sand from space.
Yeah, that's
I'm
right.
sorry for that long run-up, but...
Look, I mean, unfortunately, you know, the US and many other countries have known what's going on in Sudan for a long time. And, you know, many officials are privately outraged by the same things that we all see. But in the diplomatic hierarchy, the Far East Bureau, the interests of the relationship with countries like the UAE really just take precedence. It's as simple as that. You know, you only have to look at what's at stake at the moment. For the US, President Trump has just signed an enormous deal for artificial intelligence and data centers with the UAE. There are all these extravagant promises of investment. The US has military assets there, all these usual things. I mean, this is not, of course, I have to say, this is not a Trump administration phenomenon. This goes back, including into the Biden administration and before. I remember once meeting a senior US official in a foreign country, and he said that he just described how frustrating it was for him that when he tried to get issues onto the agenda with the Gulf about his country, that he was, as he put it, sort of put back in his place. So that's where the rubber meets the road, really, on this story.
And when you wrote your story 2 years ago, of course, it was the Biden administration. So you make that very fair point that US, quote, interests, great power interests, take precedence over these tragedies. I was in Darfur in 2005 with Secretary Rice, Condi Rice, and I mean, and you wrote in an article a few days ago, it's happening again. A wave of killings is sweeping one of the world's biggest cities, and once more the world seems unable or unwilling to do much to stop it. So how and why will this ever change? And what can we collectively, you're leading the way for all the rest of us, diplomats, those who are left after being doged, and journalists, what can we do?
One of the most obvious comparisons with, for many people, the word Darfur is resonant with what we had 20 years ago. And at that time, this was an issue. The bloodshed in Darfur was an issue that mobilized some of the most prominent celebrities in Hollywood. It mobilized the Bush administration at the cabinet level. I think Darfur was a foreign policy priority. And what's so striking now is that even though there are people here in Washington, there are people on the Hill and so on who are mobile, who are making calls, really it has not permeated the public consciousness. It hasn't had those kind of champions. And of course, it has the same constraint that we've spoken about the political constraint with the Middle East. And it's very hard, it's hard to see how does that, for advocates of Sudan, or for people who want this to be part of the public conversation, it's such a challenge to really try and bring it home to people.
What is the prospect for Sudan, given the collapse of al-Fashir and the way this military realignment is taking place?
We're now heading into a situation where the country is dividing into two main blocks. The fall of Fashir gives this RSF group control over all of Darfur and a large part of the Kordofans adjoining area. Sudan's military has the east of the country and the center. And we, unfortunately, at the start of the war, I remember the great danger was that Sudan would end up splitting and that all these foreign countries would pile in. All of these things have happened. Even what has happened in Fashir in the last couple of days and the last week is really a massacre foretold. People have been warning that this was in prospect for months and months and months. And even so, it's, the way that it's been playing out is, the way that it's been playing out really, unfortunately, has even exceeded those pretty terrible expectations. But where the country's headed, I think, is we're going to see We seem to see a de facto division that's starting to look a little bit like Libya has looked. But the difference with Libya is Sudan is, by many factors, a much larger country, surrounded by maybe 8 or 9 other countries. It faces the Red Sea. It's in the center of Africa. It's just this enormous place. So even from, I would say, from a self-interested perspective for other nation states, the implosion of Sudan is going to be, I think, an extremely unpredictable phenomenon to watch. And there's all sorts of ways that it can get even worse, I think, than it is right now.
And as you referred to what happened in 2005, George Clooney, one of the celebrated people, but everyone sort of moved on. This has become normalized in some way. And on top of that, there is what your colleague Nick Kristof writes about, which is the cutoff in foreign aid. I was traveling with Secretary Rubio on his first trip, which was in Panama. I had gone in a week early or so. I was looking for the Chinese invasion that we'd been told in the takeover of the Panama Canal. And what my reporting trip told me is that Panama runs the canal. There are 5 ports, 2 at either end, strategically controlled, or not controlled, but operated, I should have said, by a originally Hong Kong-based Chinese/British company, about. But then there was another one that was US, and another was Taiwan, and another was Singapore. And any ship that goes through the canal, which is operated by the Panamanian Canal Authority, has to be led in with a Panamanian tug. And, there are all kinds of rules, and nobody gets free passage, or nobody did at the time. So none of that was true, and there was a great deal of nationalistic resentment about the transition, threats to take over the canal, because among other countries in the region, Panama considered itself a US ally that had been actually helpful on the immigration and deportation issue, and signed an agreement the previous summer, an immigration agreement with the US. So there was a lot of resentment to that. And then the story that we ended up writing was that foreign aid was being cut off. And we were told that there would be waivers. Well, there weren't waivers. And PEPFAR followed shortly after that. And Nick Kristof has cataloged, the pennies, 12 cents a day for HIV drugs and mosquito nets and other things and also the paste, the peanut paste that is sitting in warehouses in Rhode Island and Savannah, Georgia, other places. So American farmers are losing billions of dollars in export surplus crops that they had traditionally been selling to the US government to go overseas. So we have the food and we're not feeding people. And Sudan is one of those places, well, all over Africa. What is
Sudan was at the sharp end of the USAID cuts right from the beginning. The US was funding or helping to fund really the only main network of what they call community kitchens, soup kitchens effectively, that were operating across the country, especially in Khartoum, which at that time was a city at war, and where many people, which was actually also in famine. And when we turned up there in March, the impact was extremely clear and unfortunately quite dramatic. You would go into places and find where there had been a kitchen and no longer anymore, and then you would go and meet the people who were starving, and it was as simple as that. So there's that. But then there's, the ripple. I mean, as you say, my colleague Nick Kristof has really made it his mission this year to try and document what's been going on. And it covers so many different dimensions. PEPFAR, the provision of these HIV drugs, is a huge problem. And just more broadly, we see in Africa, and to do with Gaza as well, a reshaping of the architecture of humanitarian aid. You know, it's this system that has developed over the last 50 years or so, since the 60s or the 70s. And, you know, it certainly has its critics. It has many failings, and even people who work in it would admit to those. Even USAID, even like the folks who work there, would be sometimes its sharpest critics. But for all of that, it was what was there. And we see it, you know, being challenged on the funding. We see it being challenged on the modalities. We see it on the way that the independence of aid groups are being challenged. And we see it in the fact that we now have 2 officially declared famines in the world, in Gaza and in Sudan. You know, at a time when there is no reason for anybody not to have food in this world. It's not just that the food is available, it's that we have the logistics, we have the systems that have developed over time to provide it, to get it to people in a rush. And unfortunately, that comes back to this idea that, you know, while famines until 15, 20 years ago was, you know, it was a phenomenon that had several potential causes. Famines were caused by droughts, by other things. Now famines are only a product of conflict.
And the situation in Ukraine, breadbasket to the world, when the initial months of the war, the Black Sea was shut down by Russia, the Ukrainians have managed to, with a lot of help, to open up the Black Sea and get the grain moving. And that had been causing a terrible pressure on Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa as well.
That's right.
In terms of exports. And I did a profile on this extraordinary agricultural philanthropist, Howard Buffett, a farmer in Illinois, the son of Warren Buffett, who uses his money to rebuild the silos when the Russians blow them up and help the Ukrainians demine their fields so that they can replant. And I watched him a year or so ago traveling during the holdup on the supplemental, traveling around the country to red states and talking to ranchers and farmers about not to lobby Congress, which he doesn't do as a nonprofit, but to explain to them what the dynamics of their fellow farmers in the war zone are and why they should think about what was happening in Ukraine. I mean, agriculture is, as you say, at the tip of the spear. Let me talk also about getting back to Sudan for a moment and in that whole region. The envoy, the special envoy, Masad Boulos. Tell us a little bit more. I know the Times has done some real in-depth reporting on this. Let me just tell you, his provenance is not diplomacy. He's not the Barbara Bodine of Sudan as special envoy. He is Tiffany Trump's father-in-law, who had been an exporter or importer in Nigeria of auto parts.
Small business.
Do I have it wrong?
That's right, yeah.
Something like that.
Small business. Yeah, he's this business, obviously it's a family connection that's brought him in. Some of my colleagues in the time have done a lot of work, as you say, looking at the connections between his family and some of the people who may have gotten commercial advantage around what he's been doing. But in Africa, particularly, we see he's spearheaded 2 peace drives this year. One in the Congo, where there was a signing ceremony here, I think in June, where effectively the US is doing what appears to be a sort of peace for minerals deal. And that was, the peace part is supposed to stop the fighting between the belligerents in Eastern Congo, but unfortunately that now appears to be falling apart. And so in this extremely short space of time, they've now moved on to Sudan, and there's been a big push recently with a new quad, as you said, this time not involving the UK or the UK or some of these other traditional partners, but involving the very same Gulf countries that are supplying weapons into the war. Now, I can see that there's an argument. You might say, well, if you want to make peace, you've got to bring with you the people who are responsible for the war. But it is also true that these same countries signed an agreement in September where they denounced foreign funding for the war. yet the siege of al-Fasher reached this conclusion, and everything that we've seen in the last week has played out. So you got to wonder where the sincerity is.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt if I may. This is a great conversation, and I really hate sort of jumping in, but we are a university, and we do have many students in the audience, and I'd like to give them an opportunity to ask some questions. We have a mic up there. If you have a question, please go to the mic, and I will recognize you.
And I should tell you that we've had so many wonderful students come to us as interns and then come on and become, desk assistants and producers who have attended this great university. So you have so much to be proud of.
If you could give us your name and what part of the university you're affiliated with, that would be super. Thank you.
Yes, good evening. My name is Zain Stoll. I'm in the Arab Studies Department as a student there. I had a question. You've spoken a lot about many of these new middle powers coming into Africa, but Africa also has middle powers of its own, and also with many rising. With these new changes happening, how are African actors, do they feel more emboldened? I just want to know how you think they're changing. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is probably Rwanda, Uganda, and the Eastern Congo, but you can take that however you'd like.
Yeah, great, thank you.
That's a great question.
That's a great question, yeah, and you're right. It's something I didn't really touch on very much in the talk. And it's true that there are a number of African countries that really are starting to rise up. And in many cases, they are rising in part because they're making alliances with these richer countries that are coming in from the outside. I mean, the Congo is, this country that is a cornucopia of mineral riches, and Congolese have long experience of dealing with foreigners coming in, but now they're trying to turn that to their advantage. The Rwandans, a country with very little mineral riches, but now it turns out they have very large exports of key resources, most of which seem to be coming from the Congo. But you're right that, we see we do see African countries that are rising up on their own steam. I don't want to portray them all as vassals of external influence, but we see a sort of symbiosis between and we see the leaders of these countries engaging in a sort of, I kind of look at it like window shopping. They go to the Africa summit here, they go to the one in China or in Russia, and they take from these, rather than during the Cold War, where they had to ally firmly with one side or the other. You see them saying, well, we'll take the Russian arms and we'll take the Chinese infrastructure, and maybe we'll take, in the past they might have said we'll take the American aid. That's less the case now. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Peter Hutsiera. I'm a student in the Masters of Science in Foreign Service program. By the way, I defer to you on the situation on the ground, but to get into the situation in Chad, the president, Mahamat Deby, is ethnically, at least through his father, Zagawa, and many of the people fighting against the RSF in Darfur are Zagawa, and many of the most prominent leaders, and many of them are Chadian Zagawa. So, I mean, how does this affect the ruling coalition in Chad, the fact that he's essentially serving as a rear base for the RSF, and how do you expect this to evolve, given how so many of the people in al-Fasher were Zagawas?
Yeah, that is a fantastic and very well-informed question. And the answer is that I think it places the leader of Chad in great peril, potentially. But he's managed to ride it out till now. I mean, like you say, the Zagawa are on both sides of the border, and they are actually on both sides of the fight in Fasher. For the most part, they've been fighting. The Zagawa militias have fought alongside Sudan's army in Fasher, but there is also another leader who, in recent years, Al-Haji Idris, who sided with the RSF. So it's a complicated picture, but to put it in broad terms, this ethnic group is on both sides of the border. They are intimately connected to power in Chad through the Deby family. And they're, the time that I've spent in Chad, people have worried about what would happen if Fasher fell and whether there will be a future blowback inside Chad from ethnic Zagawa who are going to be extremely angry at what happens. So It certainly is. I think it poses certainly some risk for him. On the other hand, he has a lot of money that the Emiratis have provided him. He's allied with Russia. So I think this may well end up being a test of whether that sort of foreign patronage is going to insulate him against internal challenges.
And to your point, when I talked to local reporters when I got back to the capital, and they are so anti-colonial and so resentful that even though the US was providing more refugee aid than any of the other countries at the UN, they were very anti-American, very anti-French. And when I asked about the Russians, they said, well, why not Russia? We've tried everything else. So there is no real resentment. One of the things that does work against the Chinese is they come in often to these countries, pour a lot of money in, and they don't hire local workers. They bring their own people in. So they're not doing any job training, and they're not leaving anything to make the infrastructure work, and often it doesn't.
Yeah. Resentment, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sanait Sarfino, and I am a South Sudanese American. And so my question for you, I think it's kind of a broad question. So in a world where it feels more and more like multilateralism is weakening, countries are moving away from human rights, or at least are being picky with what they define as a violation of human rights, or denouncing as a human rights violation. What do we make of human rights standards? Do those rules still apply? And where do we look for accountability?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately, as part of this change that has really accelerated so much over the last year, certainly under the Trump administration, we're seeing, these institutions that underwrite human rights at the UN, elsewhere, really coming under huge amounts of pressure. And I also think that there's a political signal that's been sent about what is acceptable. I live in Kenya. Recent months, we've seen this unusual or new phenomenon of political, not exactly dissidents, critics in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania traveling to the other country, sometimes in shows of solidarity to attend trials, and being arrested, detained, tortured, coming back with accounts of being raped. Now, these are countries that in the past were seen as, certainly the Kenyans were seen as the democratic exemplar for the region. The Ugandans and the Tanzanians, it was a more mixed picture, but this is not the kind of behavior that one saw against civil rights, against activists. And I just think, it's hard not to conclude that I think the leaders in these countries, at least in part, are calculating that they are not going to get a rebuke from Washington or from other Western countries for engaging in this behavior. So I think that's a really dismal sign. Yeah.
And there's definitely a de-emphasis on human rights. The Human Rights Report has been changed and altered in its presentation. And also the new cap in the Federal Register on refugee admissions is 7,500, which is the lowest in history. And 7,000 of those are supposed to be allegedly discriminated against white Afrikaners.
And soon possibly to include groups like the AfD in Germany.
My name is Abdullah Nasif. I'm a student at the SFS, the MSFS, and also the Arab Studies program. And I have a bit of a general question. So in light of what you spoke about today, especially in the many an arms embargo by the UAE, UN arms embargoes, EU arms embargoes, so how realistic do you think, or how do you think the UAE could be basically pressured into stopping this massive flow of arms, especially that at this point, as an open source intelligence hobbyist, you could basically see everything unfold in real time, and most of the time they really don't bother turning off their transponders of their aircraft. And so my question is, how do you think this would really come to an end, or even the pace of it? Do you see it slowing down, and how do you see that translating?
Well, unfortunately, the arms embargoes have been extremely ineffective, not just in Sudan. You look at Libya as well. I was based in Cairo before this. I covered Libya for many years. And there we saw that the arms embargo there was breached willy-nilly, almost openly, by many countries, but also by the UAE. And frankly, these embargoes really are only as good as the leverage that other countries are willing to use to enforce them. And for the most part, it's been extremely weak. So I think, arms embargo provide a sort of diplomatic talking point or, a pressure point, but there's been almost no enforcement of them.
I want to take the next two together, and you're going to be the last two questions.
Okay. Okay. Hi, my name is April. I'm the student at the School of Foreign Service. And then I just have a more personal questions, just in terms of you mentioned a lot of incident and emotional roller coaster you got during your reporting and seeing people that you actually encounter actually dying in front of you. And I was wondering for students who wanted to do the work on the ground and actually be there, how do you maintain your mental sanity and how do you continue to have the strength to continue go on your work? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want me to take one more question? Or yeah, sure. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Zuna Mustafa. I'm a master's student in the International Migration Refugee Studies program. I just really wanted to say a deep thank you as someone from Sudan. Your reporting was one of the few that truly captured the crisis, especially in 2023 when I was physically present in undergrad, but I was mentally in Sudan and there was not a lot of coverage of it. So I really appreciate that. But you've highlighted how the conflict has evolved from a civil war to what is now a proxy war involving multiple foreign actors. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on how the fight for modernity and capitalist interests shape these dynamics, particularly how we might understand neoliberalism's role and the rise of internationalism since the 1950s in both constraining and potentially reimagining African sovereignty amid the global power struggles, and if regaining ownership of our resources like the gold in Sudan is a potential answer. Is it ever possible to move away from sanctions, debt bondages, or the deep colonial violence of identity politics, which is very central to the issue of Sudan and was very central to the issue of the breakage of South Sudan as well, and how we're very aligned to the Arab states and moving away from our blackness when Sudan in Arabic means land of the blacks, which really pins us against one another. But yeah, so that was that question. And my second question is on the politics.
That is your question.
Okay, all right.
That is your question, my dear.
Great. So to the, thank you both. To the first issue about the emotional toll, I mean, Andrea should speak to this too, but of course it's always difficult. And I mean, when I was telling the story about Dr. Omar Salek there, it's always difficult, someone who, to have any sort of experience with someone and for them to die in those kind of circumstances soon afterwards. And unfortunately, I've had quite a few experiences like that covering, I mean, a lot of wars, but especially the war in Sudan. Very quickly, when we were in Khartoum in March, and at one point, the presidential palace was the main focus of the fighting, and then it fell. And we were on the other side of the river, and we needed a military escort to go across, so we went to the military office, and the guy who was supposed to give us a pass, this guy, Colonel Hassan, had vanished. So we were sitting there stewing, we couldn't go, I was on my phone, I was looking at Twitter, then I see this Colonel Hassan outside this palace where soldiers were celebrating, and we were going, oh my God, we've got to get over there, like immediately. And then half an hour after that, we see people coming out of his office crying, his staff, and it turned out that there had been a drone strike on the palace while he was standing outside being filmed by Sudan TV, and he'd been killed. And so, unfortunately, it's a hazard that these things do happen. But how you deal with it personally, I don't know. I feel like I have been blessed with, not suffering too many effects, but maybe there's a therapist out there who's going to tell me otherwise.
Was that all? Well, it's just, I mean, between Ukraine and Sudan, among those conflicts in Gaza this year, I have found it very difficult. And unfortunately, it's also meant that Gaza is the first war since World War I, maybe, that Western reporters were not allowed to cover because of the rules. And so we've had Palestinian staff, local staff there, heroically. But it is so, the violence is so random and so unpredictable that it is just hard morally to decide to keep people there, as well as the starvation, frankly, during that 4-month siege before the ceasefire agreement. And it just, you know, and also the Committee to Protect Journalists has very good data on how lethal this has been. We have lost so many journalists this year, and many of them are Palestinians.
Yeah, and to that second example, it just shows how covering these wars has gotten so much more complicated with drones. Before, as Andrea will know, it's much more predictable where you go, there are front lines. Now entire areas are denied, and it's very difficult. If I could just address quickly what the second student asked. You just raised a lot of very interesting issues, but one that I'd like to just address very quickly is this whole issue of identity, and you talked about the identity of Sudanese. I mean, in this talk, it's very much about the foreign influence, but really, at its core, of course, Sudan's war started, I think, by the fact that in the post-colonial period, after the British colonialism, Sudan never really gelled a national identity. And it's something that, as a journalist, it's you know, something Sudanese know very well, but it's sometimes very hard to explain the nuances of all the even internal racisms in Sudan between people who live on the Nile River and people in Darfur, and there's a whole language around it. And part of the challenge, the storytelling challenge for us in relaying this war is to try and give at least some of that nuance, because we don't want to underplay that as a factor. And it's often what's motivating Sudanese actors themselves in the way that they deal with each other.
And I should also say that this year, becoming close to a lot of the Israeli and American hostage families, as they are still trying to, you know, desperately to get the remains of their children, and just that aspect of the crisis as well. The New York Times is really singular in keeping their focus and having their correspondents go to these places. And very frankly, many American media companies have found that it's just too dangerous to work in these spaces anymore. So that's another reason to honor what Declan and his colleagues are doing in the real tradition, I suppose we should say, of Teddy Weinthal, for whom this award is named, who was a great journalist and diplomat.
Yes. I want to thank you both for that. And Dean, do you want to come up? We said something about this is the Weinthal Prize and lecture, so we've had the lecture part. Now we're going to do the prize part. I do want to echo what Andrea said, is the commitment of the New York Times and a lot of other, sometimes dismissed as legacy media, on the ground, reporting from the field, doing the difficult work in very, very dangerous circumstances, and making sure that this information, this awareness, this understanding is there and possible. Your depth of understanding of the complexity of the region, of the players, and of the importance of all of that to all of us. I am very pleased, very honored that you are willing and able to accept our prize. So if you would like to come up, we will actually give you the prize. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, thank you.
Yeah, so, and yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, thank you.
All right. I had to schlep this thing in from home, and now it looks like I get to schlep it back out again. Anyway, I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you found this as fascinating, thought-provoking, and probably maybe action-provoking as I did. Declan, you are extraordinary as a journalist. You are extraordinary as a writer, and you are extraordinary as a speaker. So thank you for a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.